So we definitely for sure have one person on this call. It's Tim Rosales, local strategist up in Sacramento. And we're hoping to be joined by perhaps two professors, perhaps no professors, perhaps a committeeman. It's a who's who of who could show up, who may show up. So if not, Tim and I will find ways to talk about this.
Yeah.
I think the way to start with this one is going to be just about where the GOP is on this big, beautiful bill. This is an all-encompassing bill, as I guess big and beautiful would suggest, putting in both the Trump tax cuts, extending those from 2017, and then also putting in reforms to Medicaid. Democrats would call those cuts to Medicaid, depending on the program. A lot of the back and forth over it seems to be on um, I think on work requirements for the most part.
Yeah.
It seems to be where I think there always seems to be the debate on this topic, and that's once again the case here in the Central Valley, and particularly in Congressman Representative Dave Valadao's district. It hits a little harder when you have a very swing type district, and you have these demonstrations going week after week. And Tim, we've seen so many out here. Does this change the narrative around the way that this debate is handled? Does it move lawmakers one way or the other? Perhaps David Valadao in particular.
Well, I think, one thing to consider always is that when you're thinking about the politics of policy, that you've got Democrats will always kind of try to hit Republicans on things like healthcare, Medicare, Social Security, those types of issues. Republicans typically have had, much more strength talking about public safety and tax cuts and kind of going into those types of, policy lanes. And we see that kind of lining up right here, right? You've got Democrats who are coming after vulnerable Republicans on issues like Medicare and Medicaid and cuts, what they call cuts to those programs. And Republicans are really doubling down and going hard on the tax cut issue, and highlighting all of the tax cuts that are included in here and how that impacts every single individual, from farmers to middle class families, and really walking down to service workers with tax on tips. They're really walking down some of those issues. And so we're seeing kind of the old traditional message alliances kind of form up on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. Right now, though, in the Republican favor is the fact that cost of living is, still kind of a very high, or even if not the highest issue on their concerns. The thing they have to worry about, though, that the Democrats understand is that healthcare comes into that cost calculation. And the cost and availability of healthcare, especially for people who are unfixed incomes and seniors and those types of things, that's a paramount concern. So if the Democrats can kind of muddy the water on that a little bit, because really what the Republicans are going after here is not necessarily those individuals. What they're going after is providing these free benefits towards undocumented individuals living here in the United States, and that's something that the president's been kind of pretty focused on. So the old, messaging, like I said, the old message alliances are set between Republicans and Democrats, and each side, I think, has to be a bit careful, though, not to get too far out over their skis and neglecting to respond a little bit to maybe some of the fire coming back and forth.
Well, and one of those side groups that plays a very important role, or we shouldn't even say side group because at this point they're a very main negotiator in this, is the House Freedom Caucus from Republicans.
Mhm.
They have a lot of power especially when you have a small majority in Congress. This group led by Andy Harris from Maryland. And they want to see specifics in the bills in particular.
Yeah.
Now, the concern has always been on these budget negotiations, whether it's been with a Democrat president or a Republican president, has been seeing increases to the federal deficit as well on these particular pieces of legislation. Why in particular do they have so much power? Is it because of those narrow majorities, or is it because they have a much more outsized role than perhaps they used to back in the day with the Republican Party, and that stands out more firm in this administration?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. They do have a little bit more power because of the slim majorities. So you really need the House Freedom Caucus, and Congressman Harris has said, and I think been a little bit positive lately towards this bill, saying, okay, maybe it's not something we get done here very quickly in the next day or so, but maybe in the next 10 days. I think is what he mentioned, and said that openness in order to get something done. So I think there's communication and conversation there, but they are extremely important. And, because of that slim majority, but also because you have, they are really driving a lot of the content you see out there from, conservative influencers, podcasts, news, those types of things. The House Freedom Caucus is really kind of they're the spokespeople almost, kind of for that group of Americans who are, it used to be kind of the Tea Party group, but it's evolved into this, House Freedom Caucus group. And so they really are a mouthpiece for a particular group of Republicans who are very, very fixed and entrenched on some of those issues. And so they are extremely important for the caucus in general. And Speaker Johnson has to manage that along with, the individuals in his, Republican conference, being the group of Republicans in the House of Representatives Republican conference in more moderate districts or more swing districts. And so that's a careful balance that the speaker has to weigh as he's, moving forward and managing Republican members.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to watch with exactly what's going on because in the past it seemed like to quote the Gen Z kids, the conversations were more toxic as it went to what was going on in the House as far as House leadership was concerned. It seemed that we had a bit more difficult a time watching Republicans interact with former Speaker Kevin McCarthy than they are with House Speaker Mike Johnson. And perhaps that's a great way to bring in Ian Anderson, who has popped up on the screen all of a sudden too. How are you doing, Ian?
Good. I apologize about that. I was having computer issues.
No
So,
worries. You and also Professor Monroe, who is yet to jump on the call, not to out him to our podcasting audience, but once in a while we have the computer problems. Lord knows I've had it. Sometimes I'm in a conference room randomly sitting around, so it happens to everybody. Professor, I guess the thing to go to you on this is why do you think nowadays when we hear the debate over these types of bills? Oh, and look, by the way, just as he pops up, there's Professor Monroe too. So everyone's popping up at the same time. It's terrific.
Oh,
we
you're
all
right.
want to be on your show.
Exactly. So Professor, you just missed it by a half second. Professor Anderson jumped on to it right around this time. Tim and I have been writing it out since 1:45. So sometimes it just works out that way. But Professor Anderson, to you on this one first. Why is it now a much better dynamic as far as it seems to be? You don't have the same types of outbursts that maybe you had in the McCarthy era. Does that just come with Johnson being a newer Congress member overall? He doesn't have the weight that McCarthy did, and the types of relationships that they may have had over the years that were a little bit testy, given the way that the speaker would at times negotiate with people was a little bit of not a way to mince words versus this approach, which seems to be a little bit different than that.
Yeah, well, I think that you can see that Speaker Johnson, one, is a very different type of politician than McCarthy. I mean, McCarthy's was quite a dynamic individual in his own right, and so I think comparatively, it's probably apples and oranges in a lot of ways, I would say, but also at the same time too, it's very different kind of world, I think, politically, for Johnson than it was for McCarthy. And so I think that, it's going to be very interesting to see, the holdouts, and which direction they go in the negotiation that happens, and happening right now. I as always like to say, this is the time to express your opinion to your elected official, your congressperson. Send something up to your senator. Get your opinions out there because this is what our representatives are there for. And so I think if you have an opinion, you need to express it now because that's where elected officials are listening.
Yeah, then Professor Monroe, to you, since you have this somewhat connection to one Adam Gray up in California or up in now I guess Washington D.C. where you are in Merced, I know when we see it on this side of the aisle where it has to be David Valadao, he's in Bakersfield. The impetus is on him where he has to vote a particular way or he's very closely watched into how he votes, especially when Republicans are in the majority. Is there any bit of pressure too if the tax cuts don't get extended? On Democrats at all, on someone like Adam Gray, who's in one of those very similar to Dave Valdez, very purple districts that can go either way in a midterm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is some pressure on Democrats to sort of walk the line, especially somebody that's in such a closely divided Congress and won by such a narrow margin, right? I mean, Gray's race was decided by a couple hundred votes. And now, how does that play though in terms of who he's in trouble with if the bill goes different directions, right? And I think when you really look at the vote tallies, that district had a lot of crossover vote, right? There's a lot of Republicans that seem to vote for the Democrat, vote for Gray in that race, just based on the comparisons to like Democrats up the ticket. So there's I think a pull there, and now I don't, or we can see, the vote go, obviously, it would be unusual for Democrats to break on this bill, given the sort of expansiveness of it and how many things are there. But will they be viewed as sort of, culpable if for some reason this doesn't, get through? Probably not, right? I mean, to the previous question, it's a really, looking at Johnson and thinking about him as the speaker and how that compares to McCarthy, it's really for me very contextual, right? Like the focus here is on the aftermath of the big speaker fight and the way that I think set things up for it to look very delicate within the Republican Party. And so just to an extent, I think that takes some of the attention off the Democrats, right? They sit there and watch. And I think a lot of the sort of blame or credit is going to go to the sort of management of factions within the Republican Party, maybe not, with a lot of blame across the aisle on this one.
And then Tim, to you on that, I think it's one of those things too where it just when it comes with being the party in power, the extra responsibility and the blame just does go with you, regardless of how fair a situation is if you assess it in the history books 2 years later, 2 weeks later. Is that just kind of what comes with the power?
Well, certainly it comes with the power, and we're even in a little bit bigger situation because you've got Republican Party in control of the presidency, in control of the Senate, in control of the House. And so, even though the margins there on the legislative side are thin, having that type of control across the board, does put a great deal of pressure, and also you bear responsibility for really what happens, regardless of how thin those margins might be and how much you have to negotiate. In fact, we've seen points in time in history where Congress was split. Democrats had a narrow margin at one point and whatnot, and they got in trouble and slapped back in the midterms because they had to negotiate and kind of navigate that narrow majority. So it is there are lots of pitfalls here that will have an impact potentially in 2026 for Republicans if they, and I don't want to say if they don't play it right, because some of it is almost out of their control to a degree. You almost, I think, have to look at it from the standpoint of they've got a set of issues. They know this set of issues is popular with and certainly is top of mind for a certain number of voters in the United States, and particularly those cost of living issues and tax issues and that type of thing. You got to just kind of lean into it and go with it, at this point, and really make it your own. And then you got to live or die by that during the midterms. If you try to get too fine with some of these points, politically, voters just kind of, it almost turns them off. So at this point, I think they are leaning into it. We'll see kind of how the Democrats respond.
And then Ian, I wanted to ask you something on what Tim was just touching on. It was if you have those two final points as it goes to particular fights within this thing, what is the benefit and what is the negative on having this piece of legislation literally be the big, beautiful bill? Because as people are listening to us talk about it, you hear about tax cuts, you hear about the potential of cuts or reforms to Medicaid, depending on how you view it. Then you also hear about Social Security, and people were probably wondering, okay, why is this all in one piece of legislation? Can you tell us about why this is maybe a good thing, or maybe why perhaps this is a bad thing?
Well, I think the previous point is that, right now the Republicans have majority and the biggest chance to get a lot of the campaign promises, a lot of the big sweeping changes. This is a chance to make that happen, if they're going to make, because as was brought up, the midterms are going to positive or negatively, be reflective on how people view this bill. I think to the point of, Valadao, for example, I think every other semester or so, there's an ad of some sort, either praising him or vilifying him. And I think even now I've started to see some pre-campaigning ads that have started to circulate locally, talking about the way that he is framed in voting in this, and he's even I think he's even done some media around why he's voting and the policies around that. And so I do think just why it's important now is that there's the majority, and so if we're going to be able to get a lot of this through, I mean, this is really, it's going to be harder, I think, depending on how the midterms go. So.
And Professor Monroe, to you, I mean, the midterms this year will be very interesting. We've seen updated Cook PVIs. We saw very, it's one of those where I guess if you're the cutthroat Republican, you say, well, we lost seats, so it wasn't really a winning year in California. But if you look at the congressional numbers and you look at how close some of those races are, perhaps there's really big signs of encouragement for the future. Does that really happen in a midterm, or is that more for a presidential election for Republicans? And is this the chance for Democrats to once again kind of go hunting for some of these seats, particularly the David Valadao seat here in Bakersfield and in Hanford, and throughout a lot of other areas that it's districted up through the Central Valley, in addition to some of the OC?
Well, I mean, this last round, right? The big Democrats were counting on the sort of cycle of midterms are better for Republicans, general elections are going to be better for Democrats, right? And there's sort of this, in certain areas, especially where you have sort of broader, Democratic advantages in the general electorate, right? You look at the primary and you say, okay, well that turnout's not going to look quite like that. It's going to look more Republican favorable in the primary, right? Well, the sort of same thing plays out, when you look at midterms versus generals, except as you point out, Democrats didn't have the bump that they thought they were going to have, certainly in this region, in the prior election cycle. And so in my mind, right, it opens up, it makes it a lot that cycle doesn't seem like it's playing out, right? So I think probably nobody knows, what to make of it. Like, is this a time when Republicans, maybe it is a time where you get a midterm and often the party in power is the one that sort of takes the hit. And yet, in a lower turnout election, and I don't think we can count on it being a significantly higher turnout election. Maybe it will be, but I don't know that we know that. Is that really going to see a big Democratic surge? I just don't know. I don't know that it's, if I have to guess in terms of the way that they see it, I think they see it as a replay of the last election, right? That every seat is, that we're talking about is probably sort of up for grabs, and there's a lot of unpredictability. And I think, one last quick comment, that's part of what plays here that I think is the thing that's hard for us to observe on these big bills and on these big votes is, well, both parties want to be able to hold their parties together and hold the coalition. They also understand that there are certain votes they've got to let their moderates go the other way on, right? They want to have a margin because they want to be able to allow those crossover districts to have a member be able to go and sort of campaign against the party, right? Because they need those seats. At the end of the day, they want that vote for the speakership vote, first and foremost, in the next round. And so if they can get it, they want to let some of their moderates go.
Yeah, that's an important point to make there too. Especially we saw it a little bit in this last cycle, where of course you still have those. You still had the failed campaign as it went to trying to oust David Valadao on those mailers where it said he voted to oust President Trump and voted to impeach. One of the last ones remaining. We got to get him out. Of course, this sent by Democratic groups didn't quite work per se, and you at the same time had Speaker Johnson come to Kern County. You didn't necessarily have the direct relation between Trump and Valadao in that respect, but like you said, Professor, a great point about just making sure that those that are moderates and those in the swing seats stay in power for both those parties as they try and gain a majority in 2026. As we switch over to the governor's race, just real briefly, I wanted to point this out. I don't think I've had either of you guys on or any of you guys on yet. As far as we've interviewed four candidates, we have a fifth coming in this week. Tomorrow, Betty Yee, the former state controller. We'll see what she has to say, and then we have a number of other ones scheduled for June as well. But we've had higher profile Republicans, Steve Hilton, Chad Bianco in, as well as former mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa. We also had lesser known Republican Brandon Jones, still a great interview to watch with him. makes some interesting points if you're looking for something outside the Republican mainstream. I'm sure for Democrats too, Betty Yee, maybe not quite as high profile name. We'll have her on tomorrow. So for people who want to familiarize themselves with her and are looking beyond those high profile Democrats. Tim, to you, I got a press release yesterday from Antonio Villaraigosa's team calling it out, just being concerned about Kamala Harris not jumping on Joe Biden's alleged decline early on in his presidency. What does that signal? And what more can we expect along that line as Villaraigosa runs for governor?
Well, yeah, I mean, Antonio Villaraigosa, former mayor of Los Angeles, former Speaker of the Assembly, came out yesterday and tried to distinguish himself from the other Democrats and say, "Hey, look, Kamala Harris and others, you guys were part of the problem of this cover up that seems, apparent at this point in terms of President Biden's health and at the time when he was in office." I think it is something. If you look back. Antonio Villaraigosa also ran for governor in 2018. At that time, he tried to differentiate himself by really being more of a moderate candidate, trying to appeal, particularly in the Central Valley, to ag and to Republican interests. I think Antonio Villaraigosa is going back to that "how do I differentiate myself" card. Now he's doing it, but he's doing it from within the Democratic Party. You're not going to pull Republican votes in a governor's election, in a June primary election to get past that post and get into November. But what you can do is really set yourself apart as a Democrat, not only on some issues, but also just put yourself out there. Taking a little bit different tone than what the rest of the pack is doing, and I think that's what Antonio Villaraigosa is doing right now. And I would expect him to do more of that on issues, but issues that are appealing to the Democratic base voter, and that's the voter that he is gonna need in order to be successful in June.
And Professor Anderson, to you on this too, Villaraigosa is also trying to think really hard in the Central Valley, it seems. And a number of candidates, to their credit, are actually going up and down the Central Valley as well. Steve Hilton's had several different touring events out this way. I know that Javier Becerra has dates planned out this way as well. What does the signal of, you know what, the Central Valley is worth going up and down signal to voters in this area? Then also perhaps what does it signal to voters that are maybe felt that their vote and that their voice doesn't matter on the coastal areas as well, that feel like there's only been this one route as far as Democratic establishment has been, in particular those that are close to the Newsom administration as it stands right now? What say you?
I think that it's really interesting, kind of the discussion that always talks about Kern County. Is it red or blue, or is it purple? And although it is, predominantly red, it's very close when you really look at the breakdown of registered Democrats and Republicans. But then also when you compare that to independents and non-party preference, right? We talk about it, so it's not as I would say is solid as red county as people like to think. And so it's also part of the reason why you're starting to see, a lot of the, I think some of the campaigning down there. But at the same time, there are very significant ties into the Republican Party that are part of Kern County. McCarthy is still very much, part of the political mainstream in a different way. And so I think it shows that, Kern County in this area is still very much a player, and it's worth both parties to be able to come in and try to sway voters one way or another. It also shows that there are seats that there's potential to flip. I think kind of going back to part of previous question about the candidates trying to separate themselves from Harris and then Biden in the most recent election. I think it kind of talks to a larger piece of the Democratic Party going through some reform and change. I think that was a big part of the discussions now, why they weren't successful at the presidential level. I think you're going to see more of candidates trying to say, like I'm trying to get back to the core root of who the Democrat Party really is. And I think there's going to be a redefining of that. It's going to be very interesting to see the candidates that come out, in this upcoming gubernatorial election. So again, it just continues to highlight it's important to pay attention to government politics and to participate.
And then Professor Monroe, to you, I want to close off with Javier Becerra as well. And the reason why I want to close off with Javier Becerra is because he did an interview with Alex Michelson, our affiliate, Fox affiliate in Los Angeles, where basically there was a conversation about all these things he wants to do to reform California, to rebalance. But then also the same interview has him talking about suing the Trump administration, 80,000 times. And in the same respect, also not really pointing out those particulars of how he's going to be necessarily different from the Newsom administration, aside from just, a few administrative differences or just the policy, or, okay, we got to reform the budget. Um, I think that mixed with the fact that he's coming off as being Biden's HHS, uh, there's a lot of interesting things. How do those more liberal candidates who still want to differentiate themselves from both perhaps Governor Newsom and President Biden, is there a lane for them to do so, especially if Kamala Harris is the looming Democratic candidate in this race, Democratic frontrunner?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you sort of mentioned it in terms of, Mayor Villaraigosa separating himself in sort of tone. And I think, this is a case where maybe, it's not so much a distinction of either policy or tone as much as it is sort of context, right? You know, Harris is going to be one of the, a candidate that is tied to the Biden administration in a way that I think is even more, sort of direct and obviously out front than Becerra. And so, in a sense, there's going to be a way, there's going to be an ability to vote for a very liberal candidate, right? Which has been a very successful strategy, policy wise for governor and for statewide offices, right? That's still the sort of winning, ideology. If you look over the, past decade or two, but not having sort of the relationship to the national politics that Harris is going to have, right? It maybe is an advantage, right? Maybe maybe you're the can't you sort of pitch yourself if you're Becerra as the candidate who is the sort of down the middle liberal for California, but that doesn't have that kind of, immediate history that could be frustrating for some of the Democratic Party. So I think, that's the lane if I have to sort of pick one, and I'm sort of, I'm making the case within the campaign of how to position themselves.
And then Tim, there's the Rick Caruso bomb, whether or not that goes off right.
Oh, always. But I think he seems to be focused right now in Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles. I think there's enough there potentially to keep him busy, but he does have a choice to make, and certainly everybody's going to be watching what he does.
I think that's the biggest thing right now is finding out who exactly is that person that's in second place. Should Kamala Harris run for this seat? She's obviously, from what the polls would indicate, would poll somewhere between 30 to 50%, it would seem, in the primary as it stands right now. That said, very high unfavorability ratings, too. You can attribute that probably mostly to Republican voters, perhaps some Democrats who want a change of scenery. But when push comes to shove, do those Democrats who view her as unfavorable now, if the choice is between her and one of those harder line Republicans, do they really go, the way of the Republican, or do they, when push comes to shove, do they go back to the Democrat? And that comes from both that may be more moderate and that may be more off to the progressive lanes as well if they want to come back home and eventually vote for her. Should she decide again to run, because that we're still waiting on that announcement, whether or not that's going to happen. We are expecting it sometime in the summer, perhaps around June, July, and August. So we'll see what happens there. Thank you all so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.